Karen slapped my mom at church. Didn't know my dad's the pastor. It was a warm Sunday morning, the kind that made the stained glass windows of our old neighborhood church sparkle like gems as the sun hit them just right. I remember the golden glow spilling into the pews as my family and I walked in, hand in hand, the way we always did. My mom wore her favorite sky blue dress, the one with white floral prints along the hem, and my dad, the pastor of the church, wore his usual gray suit and purple tie. He had been the heart of the congregation for years, calm, kind, and firm when he needed to be. My mom, his quiet supporter, never sat in the front row or demanded attention. She preferred to stay somewhere in the middle, always near families with small children, always smiling, always ready to lend a gentle touch or a reassuring whisper if someone was nervous or new. That morning, the church was buzzing with life, hymns already playing softly as people trickled in, hugs exchanged, bulletins passed around, and a few kids running down the aisle before being gently ushered back to their seats. I remember watching my dad step up to the podium with his usual ease. He opened the service with a soft-spoken prayer and a warm welcome. As he spoke, my eyes wandered across the congregation, settling on someone unfamiliar sitting near the back, an older white woman I'd never seen before. She looked like a typical suburban churchgoer at first glance. Pastel cardigan, big sun hat, large purse clutched tightly in her lap. But there was something about her demeanor that immediately caught my attention. She wasn't singing during the hymns. She wasn't smiling. Instead, she looked annoyed. Her eyes darted around the room like she was taking mental notes of all the things she didn't approve of. I didn't think much of it at first. We get newcomers all the time, and not everyone feels comfortable the first day. Maybe she was just shy. Still, the way she kept glancing over at the family with a toddler 2 rows ahead of her, and the way she scowled when someone laughed softly during the announcements, it felt like something was brewing. The service continued without much disruption for the first 15 minutes. My dad transitioned into the call to prayer, and the congregation bowed their heads. A peaceful hush fell over the room as everyone closed their eyes. I could hear the soft rustle of clothing, the faint sniffle of someone overcome by emotion, and then, barely above a whisper, my mom's voice. She was sitting just a few rows ahead of me, comforting a little girl who had started to fidget and whimper during the quiet. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered gently, her hand resting lightly on the girl's shoulder. "You're safe here." The girl's mom nodded appreciatively, grateful for the support. It was the kind of moment that made me proud of her, always motherly, even to strangers. But just as the child began to calm down, a sharp voice pierced through the quiet like a thorn in silk. "Can you please be quiet? Some of us are trying to pray." The words rang out louder than they needed to, spoken with that specific tone of condescension that makes the hair on your neck stand up. Everyone's eyes flicked open, heads turning in the direction of the disruption. It was the woman from the back, the one with the sun hat and the stiff posture. Her face was red with irritation, eyes narrowed into sharp slits as she glared directly at my mom. My mom blinked, startled, and immediately responded with a soft, "I'm so sorry." She looked embarrassed, clearly not wanting to cause a scene. My dad, still standing at the pulpit, paused mid-prayer and opened his eyes, calmly observing the interruption. He didn't say anything just yet, maybe hoping it would fizzle out on its own. But Karen, yes, I would soon come to know that was her name, wasn't done. She shook her head, muttering something under her breath about people not respecting sacred moments and how noisy some folks could be. A few people glanced uncomfortably in her direction, but no one spoke. We were all still in that awkward place of not knowing how serious she was, or how far she was willing to go. My mom returned her attention to the child, whispering once again, but even more softly this time, just enough to soothe without drawing attention. Unfortunately, that seemed to set Karen off even more. She let out a loud sigh, exaggerated for everyone to hear, and crossed her arms as if she was the only one being wronged in a room full of worshippers. I could feel the tension building. I watched the expressions shift on the faces of nearby congregants: disbelief, discomfort, unease. Still, most of us stayed silent. That was the unspoken rule in church. Avoid conflict, show grace, keep the peace. But something in me tightened, a slow burn in my chest. It wasn't just about being embarrassed anymore. It was about watching someone act like my mom was nothing more than background noise to be scolded and dismissed. My mom, who had never raised her voice in anger inside this church, who had baked for every fundraiser, prayed for strangers, and shown nothing but kindness. The audacity of this stranger coming into our space and throwing judgment like stones in glass windows, it was hard to swallow. My dad cleared his throat again, just enough to signal he was about to continue. He gave a pointed glance toward the back, clearly trying to move things along without causing more tension. Karen huffed but didn't say anything else, at least not yet. The prayer resumed, but the atmosphere was no longer peaceful. It was like everyone was waiting for something else to happen, like the silence had become too sharp, too loaded. I sat there with clenched fists, wondering if Karen had truly let it go, or if she was just getting started. I had no idea at the time that this woman, this entitled stranger who had stormed into our Sunday like she owned the place, was about to take things much, much further. And when she did, she'd learn a lesson she'd never forget. Because the woman she slapped wasn't just a quiet lady in the pew. She was the pastor's wife. And my dad was not the kind of man who let injustice stand, especially not in God's house. The rest of the prayer barely finished before the unease that had settled over the room began to twist into something heavier, something dense and fragile, like the air right before a storm breaks. The congregation, a close-knit group who'd attended this church for years, some for decades, seemed to sit a little stiffer in their pews. My mom had offered the quietest, most well-intentioned whisper to a child, something she had done countless times before without a single complaint. But this time, there was someone new in the room, someone who didn't understand our community, didn't care to understand the kindness at play, and instead only saw disruption where there had been compassion. Karen had drawn attention to herself like a firecracker in a library, and now everyone was watching her out of the corners of their eyes, wondering if she'd erupt again. My dad picked up where he left off, continuing the sermon with a steady voice that tried to bring peace back into the space. But even he couldn't fully hide the tension in his jaw or the way his eyes flicked toward the back of the room where Karen sat, arms crossed and lips pursed like she was sucking on a lemon. He was a patient man, my father. He'd been the pastor here for more than 15 years and had seen his share of drama, grief, even the occasional heated disagreement. But never, not once, had he seen someone behave this rudely in the middle of a service. Still, he held his composure, guiding the congregation back into Scripture as best he could. I sat next to my siblings, watching Karen like a hawk. Every time someone around her shifted or murmured, even slightly, she turned her head sharply like she was ready to pounce. There was something about her that radiated entitlement, a kind of brittle superiority that didn't belong in a place meant for humility and grace. She tapped her nails loudly against the wooden pew, drew exaggerated breaths, and muttered under her breath, too low to be clearly heard but loud enough to be noticed. I could see other members looking uncomfortable, unsure whether to speak up or keep pretending it wasn't happening. No one wanted to be the one to make things worse. Then, during a particularly quiet moment in the sermon, my dad had just asked the congregation to reflect in silence for a brief prayer of gratitude. It happened again. The same child from earlier gave a small sniffle, the kind that comes naturally after holding in tears. My mom, seated beside the girl, leaned in and gently rubbed her back. She wasn't even speaking this time. Just that soft, nurturing touch that only mothers and caretakers seem to possess. But apparently, that was too much for Karen. "Oh my God, can you control your child?" she snapped, loud enough for the entire church to hear. Every head turned at once, the silence now shattered by her cutting voice. The girl wasn't even her child and everyone around knew it. But Karen had decided to double down and she was escalating. "This is ridiculous. Some people have no respect for the Lord's house," she said, standing up this time. She pointed toward my mom, voice growing louder and more venomous with each word. "You can't even shut up for 5 minutes. You people think you can just do whatever you want." That phrase, "you people," landed like a slap in its own right. There was a gasp from someone across the aisle, and the air in the room instantly changed. It wasn't just tension anymore. It was disbelief. My mom, still seated, turned around slowly to face her, stunned. Her expression wasn't angry. If anything, she looked more hurt than anything else, like someone had just thrown mud on something sacred. The little girl next to her began to cry again, now genuinely frightened. Her mother, red-faced with embarrassment and anger, reached out to shield her, but Karen didn't stop. "I come here to find peace, not noise. You're all letting this circus go on like it's acceptable," Karen shouted, gesturing wildly around the room. Her voice echoed off the walls, far louder than anything my mom had ever whispered. At that moment, I wanted to scream, to stand up and tell her to sit down and shut up, to stop humiliating my mom and terrifying a child in front of an entire room of people. But before I could even move, she did the unthinkable. She walked toward our row, fast and furious, and before anyone could stop her, she raised her hand and brought it down hard across my mom's cheek. The sound echoed through the sanctuary like a gunshot, sharp and horrible and final. My mom's head jerked to the side from the force of it, and for a moment no one moved. No one breathed. The world froze in place. Then chaos broke the stillness. I stood up so fast I nearly knocked over the pew in front of me. My heart was racing, adrenaline flooding my body in waves. I had never seen my mom struck like that. Never seen anyone strike another person in church, of all places. My siblings were shouting. The child next to my mom was screaming. The girl's mother lunged forward like she wanted to rip Karen's head off. And yet Karen just stood there, panting, chest heaving, like she was the victim. My dad descended from the pulpit like a shadow, moving quickly and silently until he was standing in front of my mother. He gently touched her face, checking her cheek, his expression unreadable. But his eyes burned with something I hadn't seen in him before, not rage, but something deeper, heavier. Disappointment. Fury held in check by faith. He turned slowly to face Karen, who had stepped back a little, now unsure of her footing. "You just struck my wife," my father said, his voice calm but deadly serious. "In the house of God." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish, her earlier bravado crumbling in the silence that followed his words. She muttered something about being provoked, about disruptive behavior, but no one was listening anymore. The congregation had shifted entirely. Where once there had been hesitation to get involved, now there was outrage. People stood up from their seats. One of the ushers moved toward Karen, slowly but deliberately, like a lion closing in on prey. "I think it's time you left," my father said simply. And that was the moment everything changed. Karen stood frozen, blinking rapidly as if still processing the fact that she had just assaulted someone in front of an entire congregation. Her face, previously flushed with rage, began to pale as my father's calm words settled over her like a verdict. The room was suffocatingly quiet again, but it wasn't the reverent hush of prayer or reflection. It was the raw, stunned silence of a group of people trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. My mother still sat there, her hand gently pressed to her cheek, but not a single tear fell. She wasn't broken, not by a long shot, though the red mark on her face said enough about the violence she had endured. The child beside her had curled up in her mother's arms, sobbing softly into her blouse while the girl's mother held her tightly and glared at Karen with a mixture of disgust and fury. Around them, members of the congregation looked back and forth at one another, then at Karen, waiting for someone to act. And my dad, standing there between his wife and her attacker, looked like a man who had just watched the sacredness of his sanctuary be shattered by a person who had no business being inside it. The usher who had begun moving stepped up beside Karen and placed a gentle but firm hand on her elbow. He was a tall man, older, a long-time member of our church with a presence that commanded respect without needing to raise his voice. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you need to come with me." But Karen jerked her arm away and took a step back like a cornered animal. "Don't you touch me," she spat, eyes wide now, her voice shaky but still loud. "This is a public space. I have the right to be here." I was assaulted first by that woman whispering and disturbing the prayer. Her voice cracked on the last word, and though she tried to rally her indignation again, it was clear that the confidence was starting to unravel. The room didn't agree with her. She could feel it. The weight of dozens of glares, all silently condemning her, pressing in from every direction. People she didn't know and would never see again, but whose judgment now hung around her neck like a stone. My father didn't raise his voice, didn't move toward her, didn't match her aggression. That wasn't his way. Instead, he simply turned to the congregation and said, "Let's pause the service here. This is no longer a house of peace until this situation is resolved." With that, he stepped aside, signaling with a small nod to the other ushers, who had quietly emerged from the sides of the church. There were 3 of them now, forming a respectful but unyielding barrier around Cairn. Still, she looked like she might try something. Her eyes darted to the doors, to the pews, back to my mom. And then she said something that sent another ripple through the already frayed tension in the room. "You people always make yourselves the victims," she hissed under her breath, but just loud enough for those nearest to hear. A few gasps echoed in response. My stomach twisted, my fists clenched, and I saw more than one member of the congregation step forward as if to confront her directly, but my father lifted a single hand to hold them back. He walked over to Cairn slowly, calmly, and stood before her without a hint of fear. His voice was quiet now, but every word carried across the room with the weight of authority. "You are not welcome here any longer," he said. "Not after what you've done, and certainly not with that kind of hate in your heart." Cairn flinched slightly, as though she had expected to be yelled at, maybe even physically dragged out, but instead she was faced with grace and strength she didn't know how to counter. The usher beside her gestured again toward the aisle, and this time she moved. Her steps were jerky, quick, like she wanted to get out before anything else was said, before the shame grew any heavier. The congregation parted silently as she walked down the center aisle, eyes following her every move. She kept her head up, chin high, but it was clear that whatever arrogance she had entered with had now been replaced by something far more desperate, something resembling fear, or perhaps just the realization that she had overplayed her hand in a place that wouldn't tolerate cruelty disguised as righteousness. As soon as she reached the double doors at the entrance of the church, they swung open with a groaning creak, and daylight poured in. The usher guided her outside, and the doors shut behind her with a finality that felt almost biblical. There was a pause, a stillness as if the entire building was exhaling. And then, almost immediately, people began moving, rising from their pews, checking on my mom, hugging the mother of the little girl, wiping their eyes, murmuring to one another in low voices filled with shock and sympathy. I walked over to my mom and dropped to my knees beside her. "Are you okay?" I asked, voice shaking more than I wanted it to. She gave me a small, tired smile and nodded. "I'm all right," she said softly, "just shaken." The mark on her cheek had started to darken into a welt, and someone from the congregation handed over a cold compress wrapped in a napkin. My mom pressed it to her face and leaned into my dad's side when he sat down beside her. His arm wrapped around her shoulders protectively, and he leaned in to kiss her temple. "I'm sorry," he said to her, barely audible, but I caught it. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that here." She didn't say anything, just gave his hand a squeeze. People began coming over in waves. Old friends, church members, even visitors who had only been to our church a handful of times. One by one, they offered words of love, support, outrage, and disbelief. They spoke about how they had never seen such behavior in this sacred space, about how proud they were of how my father had handled it, about how wrong it was that my mother had been treated that way. My siblings and I hovered close, still running hot with adrenaline and protective instinct, but we also felt the warmth of our community rise around us like a shield. Eventually, my father stood again and gently called everyone back to their seats. "The sermon wasn't finished," he said, "but maybe today's message had been spoken louder through action than words." He talked about forgiveness, about dignity, about how we respond when tested, not with violence, not with retaliation, but with strength, clarity, and love for what is right. The room hung on every word. And though the service didn't go as planned, something about the way he finished it made it feel even more meaningful, more powerful than any carefully written speech could have ever been. The slap had echoed, yes, but so had the response. And in that echo, our church didn't fall apart. It stood taller, stronger, together. By the time the service came to a close, the church had transformed from a place of disruption into one of resilience. The noise, the slap, the hatred, none of it had broken us. Instead, it felt as though we had all gone through something together, something painful and humiliating yet unifying. It wasn't just my mom who had been struck that day. It was the entire sense of peace and sanctity that our church stood for. And yet, in the face of that, we didn't fall apart. We didn't descend into chaos or retaliate with fury. We came together, quietly but powerfully, and reclaimed the space that had been invaded by ugliness. People lingered after the final benediction, more than usual, staying behind to make sure my mom was okay, to thank my dad for handling things with such calm authority, and to let us all know that we weren't alone in our shock or in our strength. You could feel it in the way people spoke, in the gentle tones and firm embraces, that unspoken agreement that Cairn had crossed a line none of us would allow to be drawn again. After helping to gather some of the offering envelopes and assisting a few older members out to their cars, I returned to the fellowship hall where my mom had been resting with a few close friends. Her cheek had begun to swell slightly, though the cold compress helped, and someone had even brewed a pot of chamomile tea, as if trying to restore a sense of normalcy through routine kindness. She sat at one of the long tables, her fingers wrapped gently around a warm mug, her eyes scanning the room as people passed by with soft expressions and quiet support. My dad stood nearby, talking with two elders of the church, his brow furrowed in thought. I didn't need to hear the words to know what the conversation was about. This wasn't the kind of event you could sweep under the rug, not in a church this close-knit, not when it happened right in front of dozens of witnesses. Word had already started to spread. Even as the building emptied out and the parking lot grew quiet, the buzz of what had happened lingered. A few people had taken footage on their phones, not of the slap itself, but of Cairn's loud shouting, her being escorted out, her snarling at the ushers. It didn't take much imagination to fill in the gaps. I'd heard one of the teenagers mention posting a clip online, and I had a sinking feeling that by nightfall, the entire story would be out there for the internet to dissect, debate, and share. Part of me hated that. I didn't want my mom's pain to become fodder for clicks and comments, even if the world needed to know what entitlement looked like in its rawest, ugliest form. But another part of me understood. Sometimes, the only way people believe something this outrageous is if they see it with their own eyes. Back at home later that afternoon, our living room was unusually quiet. Normally, Sundays were filled with leftovers from the potluck, laughter from whatever family stayed to visit, and the soft background noise of gospel music playing through the speakers. But today, it was just us. My siblings and I sat nearby, still shaken, still angry, still playing the scene over and over in our minds like a film we couldn't stop rewinding. My dad paced slowly, phone in hand, periodically stopping to check messages that kept pouring in. Dozens of texts from church members, friends, other pastors in the area, some offering help, others expressing horror, some asking for advice on how to handle similar incidents if they ever occurred. It was surreal, like watching the shockwaves of one woman's entitlement ripple outward and shake the very foundation of a community built on grace. Eventually, my dad sat beside my mom, took her hand, and looked her in the eye. "I know this might sound strange," he said, voice low and measured, "but I think this might have been a necessary storm." My mom raised an eyebrow, but she didn't interrupt. He continued, "We've always said that our church should be open to everyone, that we don't turn people away. But I think today showed us that open doors still need boundaries, that protecting peace is just as holy as offering it." My mom nodded slowly, her eyes wet but clear. "I don't regret whispering to that little girl," she said softly. "I'd do it again." My dad gave a quiet laugh and squeezed her hand. "That's why I love you," he replied. "You never stop mothering." That night, the video went viral. Not in the explosive, millions of views an hour's way that celebrity gossip does, but in the slow-burning, outrage-driven, community-sharing kind of way. Churchgoers from other cities, even other states, began commenting and reposting. People were stunned. Some couldn't believe the audacity, others shared their own horror stories of cairns interrupting sacred spaces. But more than anything, the message that spread wasn't just about the slap, it was about how our church handled it. The calm, the dignity, the refusal to stoop to her level. My dad's words became quoted captions. Screenshots of him standing protectively beside my mom were shared with notes of admiration, and even local news outlets reached out by the following morning to request interviews. It was overwhelming, especially for my mom, who had never once sought attention, who had always been content to work quietly behind the scenes. But now, she had unintentionally become the face of what it meant to endure cruelty with grace. Somewhere between all the noise, Karen was identified. People found her social media accounts, old Facebook comments, even reviews she had left on businesses that painted a very clear picture of someone who had a long history of entitled behavior. It was all laid bare. And while I didn't take joy in the digital mob that formed, I couldn't pretend I didn't feel a certain grim satisfaction knowing that she was facing the consequences she so desperately tried to avoid. Because she hadn't just insulted a woman in church. She had struck a pastor's wife during prayer. She had disrespected a child, frightened a family, and tried to insert her hatred into a space that had only ever offered love. And now, the world knew it. But even with all the attention, my parents remained humble. My dad declined the interviews. My mom asked people not to dwell on the slap but to focus on the bigger message, about why it matters to protect kindness, to uphold peace, to respond to hate with something stronger than silence, but softer than vengeance. And that, more than anything, made me proud, not just of how they handled it, but of who they were. The kind of people who could be wounded in front of the world and still come out of it not bitter, but stronger. Not embarrassed, but anchored in truth. Not broken, but bolder than before. The following Sunday, everything felt different. The air in the sanctuary carried a heavier weight, not just because of what had happened, but because everyone knew it wasn't over. Yet despite that, our church stood more united than ever. There was a shared energy of quiet resolve, a silent agreement that no one would let the events of the previous week define who we were as a congregation. My father walked through the church doors that morning not just as a pastor, but as a protector of his family and of the sacred peace we had always taken for granted. My mom walked beside him, head held high, dressed in soft lavender with the faintest shadow of last week's bruise barely visible beneath her makeup. She hadn't hidden. She hadn't withdrawn. And in doing so, she reminded everyone that kindness and strength weren't opposites. They were, in fact, one and the same. The room was packed, more so than usual. There were familiar faces, of course, but also new ones. People we'd never seen before came in small groups, individuals, even entire families, drawn by the story that had spread across social media and into the broader community. They didn't come to gawk or relive the drama, but to witness something real, something healing. Some of them had reached out online, sharing their own stories of church trauma, of spiritual spaces lost to judgment and cruelty. Many had stopped going to church altogether, but now found themselves moved by what our congregation had stood for that day. So they came, seeking hope, restoration, maybe even redemption in a world where decency had begun to feel like a forgotten relic. The service began as it always did, music, greetings, scripture. But you could tell there was a current of anticipation in the room, a hum beneath the surface waiting for the moment to come. And when my dad finally stepped up to the pulpit, there was no need for preamble. He didn't mention Karen by name. He didn't recap the incident. He simply looked around the sanctuary, pausing on each section like he was making eye contact with every single person there, and then he said, "Some moments test the soul of a community." The words rang out clear and steady. "Last week we were tested, and you all showed me something beautiful. You showed me what grace looks like in action. You showed me that we are more than just a congregation, we are a family. And in this family, no one raises their hand in hate and expects to remain welcome. Not under this roof, not in this house. There was a murmur of agreement, a few quiet amens, the occasional nod from long-time members who had seen the church grow through countless seasons. And then he continued, explaining that after prayer and consideration, the church council had made a decision. Karen would be permanently banned from the premises. Not as an act of vengeance, but as a boundary drawn in love, for the safety of our members, for the sanctity of our worship, and for the message it would send to anyone who thought church was a place to exert control, entitlement, or abuse under the guise of piety. Forgiveness, my dad said gently, does not mean we allow the same harm to happen again. Forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves, but trust must be earned and safety must be protected. After the sermon, a line formed around my mother. People hugged her, thanked her, praised her for her courage and patience. A few of the younger girls in church clung to her skirt like she was some kind of guardian angel, and honestly, I could see why. She had always been strong, but now she was more than that. She had become a symbol of resilience wrapped in kindness, someone who could be knocked down and still rise with grace, someone who made others feel safe just by being in the room. I watched her laugh softly with an elderly member who had brought her fresh flowers from their garden. She hugged a single mom who had cried the week before when Karen had lashed out. She spoke to a newcomer who had driven across the city just to meet the woman who had stayed calm in the face of cruelty. It was as though every gentle word she'd whispered over the years had come back to her, carried by the very community she had helped nurture in quiet, unspoken ways. Outside the church, the story took on a life of its own. News stations had reported on the event with surprising fairness, some even highlighting the broader themes of racism, respect, and entitlement in religious spaces. Karen's identity had been confirmed through online sleuths, and she quickly became the focus of intense backlash. Her past behavior, entitled rants at restaurants, condescending comments online, reviews filled with veiled threats, surfaced and painted a clear picture of a pattern. Some people felt sorry for her, others condemned her, and a few called for compassion. But in our home, we didn't dwell on her anymore. We didn't look for updates. We didn't read the comments. We had moved on, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much to let her keep taking up space in our hearts. A few weeks later, my mom and dad sat down in our kitchen with a group of young pastors and their spouses from nearby churches. They had reached out after hearing what happened and wanted guidance. How do you keep a space safe without turning it into a fortress? How do you protect your congregation without losing the openness that makes faith beautiful? My dad poured coffee and spoke from his heart. My mom shared her story and listened to theirs. What had begun as a slap in the middle of a prayer had become something much larger, an awakening. A moment of reckoning for how spiritual communities can choose either to bend under the weight of cruelty or to rise stronger through it. In the months that followed, our church grew, not just in size but in depth. People came not because we were trending, but because they saw something different in us, something authentic. We weren't perfect, but we were honest. We were committed to creating a place where love wasn't just preached, it was practiced, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. And that Sunday, when Karen had thought she could slap a woman during worship and walk away with no consequences, she didn't know the full story. She didn't know that woman was married to the pastor. She didn't know the strength that quiet voice carried. She didn't know the kind of man my father was, or the power of a congregation that stood together. She didn't know she wasn't walking into just any church. She was walking into our home, and we would never let hate live there.